Commissioner. I will start screen share. In the meantime, Gabby, please go ahead introducing us.
Sure, sounds good. All of us are affiliated with the Citizen Lab at University of Toronto, and our presentation today is focusing on how the Duterte regime's response to COVID-19 is essentially a process of securitization, and what this means for civil liberties and human rights. In particular, we'll be looking at the different elements of the securitization process, specifically the audience. I think next.
So our research topic was based off of concerns that have been raised regarding President Duterte's law and order approach to tackling the pandemic. And this approach shifted the pandemic from a public health issue to one of national security. And we explore how the Philippines has securitized its response to COVID-19. And we do this by framing our research around securitization theory and using discourse analysis and process tracing as our methods for research. Next slide, please. Yeah. In our presentation today, we'll first go through a brief background of President Duterte, populism, and social media, including the Philippine war on drugs and previous attempts of securitization. Next, we'll go through our research questions for the paper. Then I'll provide an overview of the COVID-19 response in the Philippines and a timeline of events. And lastly, I'll pass it over to Gabby, who will go through securitization theory, the role of the audience, and our preliminary findings. The 2016 presidential contest in the Philippines, which Duterte won, is widely considered as the first social media campaign in the Philippines. And the role of social media in this election was significant because it allowed for a direct connection between the leader and the people, bypassing traditional media, which was deemed as part of the corrupt elite. And Duterte supporters were the most active group online, and they were even coined as diehard Duterte supporters because of their loyalty and support for Duterte during the campaign. And he was also called a populist, which we will define using Moffitt and Tormey's definition, which characterizes populism as a political style, where political style is repertoires of performance that are used to create political relations. And former President Chavez of Venezuela and President Ahmadinejad of Iran are among those considered as populists. And furthermore, the relationship between populism and social media is well documented, with populist leaders harnessing the energy and engagement of social media to advance their messages to supporters, and also for supporters to use social media to share messages among themselves. And an example of how Duterte was able to use his populist style and social media to craft his narrative was through the war on drugs. He campaigned on a war on drugs and on the use of violence against drug dealers and users. He was also able to securitize the issue by framing it as one of security and not a social or health issue. He said things like, and I quote, "There are 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them," unquote. And the result is that his violent campaign and his rhetoric was wildly popular, with net satisfaction ratings of over 70%, despite over 27,000 drug-related killings. Next slide, please. And so moving on to our research questions for the paper, we're interested in seeing if Duterte's law and order approach and the use of media by supporters translates to the situation of COVID-19. And if we see similar rhetoric and tactics in response to the pandemic. Second, we try to understand if securitization theory could be used to explain this phenomenon. And our data set includes pro-Duterte fan pages and influencers, as well as Duterte and other key officials. And now to give a background on COVID-19 in the Philippines, we start with a timeline of events. And this is important because events may serve as justification for extraordinary measures. For example, on March 16th, Luzon, which in the Philippines is its largest island and contains over 50% of the country's population, was placed under a strict community quarantine, and with other provinces following after. And this meant that people were not allowed to leave their houses to exercise or to gather, no public transport was running, and people were only allowed to leave the house to go to work in a select number of essential industries. On March 24th, a national task force was formed to combat COVID-19 and to streamline implementation of regulations. But the top 3 officials in that task force were all military officials. And on March 25, the Bayanihan to Heal Us One Act came into effect, which granted President Duterte additional authority to combat the pandemic. And lastly, on April 1st, President Duterte gave a speech where he said, and I quote, "My orders to the police and the military. If anyone creates trouble and their lives are in danger, shoot them dead." And you can also see on the timeline here that posts about COVID and coronavirus on Facebook spiked up around this time as well. Next slide, please. And lastly, looking at the overall response against COVID-19 in the Philippines, it has been the longest lockdown in the world, with the whole country still under community quarantine. And just recently, in October, those under 15 and over 65 were permitted to leave the house for purposes other than essential supplies and work. And they've been under a lockdown for half a year. And travel across the country is still not permitted except for work purposes. We also saw that military officials were mainly in charge of the lockdown process and in implementing regulations and other curfews. And there's also been reports of violations of human rights during this lockdown period, with examples such as being forced by the police to sit under the sun, detaining individuals, breaking lockdown, and putting them in dog cages, straight up being beaten by the police, and humiliating LGBTIQ individuals by forcing them to kiss and to dance on video. And with that, I'll pass it over to Gabby to talk about securitization theory and our findings.
Yeah, so a lot of our research draws from securitization theory, which was coined initially by Barry Buzan, Ola Weaver, and Jaap de Wilde. Essentially, I look at it as more of a process. So the securitization process essentially takes an issue and transforms it into usually a security threat, national security threat, the securitizing actor typically being the state because they have the power to do so. Why would they do this? In essence, to pass extraordinary or exceptional measures to protect the things that are being threatened. So this could be anything from public health to national security to public order. And when these things are deemed important enough for exceptional measures, that's when you get some of the militarized responses that we've been seeing. So to sum it up real quick, there's a lot of elements within securitization theory. I've already talked about the referent object. That's the thing that needs to be protected. So in this case, it's public health and national security, at least the way the Duterte administration has framed it. The threat in this case being COVID-19 and its vectors. So that could be the quarantine violators as the threat. The securitizing actor in this case is most definitely the Duterte administration. And then the audience. The audience is a really interesting and crucial part of this process, and one we're going to get into later on. But the audience is who the securitizing actor is speaking to. I'll speak more on this afterwards, but it's who they essentially either want to win over, need to convince, or who give them the legitimacy for them to then enact the measures they want to. And the extraordinary measures, again, being the policies and legislation or actions to address this threat. Next slide. Oh yeah, and one more thing I'll mention is in previous literature, there's been a lot about securitization theory and other health crises. So if anyone's interested, there's been some cool stuff done on, I think, SARS, H1N1, AIDS, and HIV as well. So the fact that COVID-19 is another one on top of this adds more to the body of literature. So the audience is what we're really focusing on in this case. So initially, when Buzan and Ola Weaver and de Wilde came up with the idea of the audience, it was a pretty passive one. It was essentially we're this receptacle to receive information and either we accept or reject what the state is telling us. However, since then, a lot more has changed. Whether you're in a democracy or in a liberal or authoritarian government, the audience is seen as very important because it gives legitimacy to the securitizing actor. Even within more liberal environments. So the definition we're going with is by Adam Cote, and essentially says it's the individuals or groups that has the capability to authorize the view of the issue presented by the securitizing actor and legitimize the treatment of the issue through security practice. And so when we think about the audience in the case of Duterte and COVID-19, what we want to look at is, as a populist, when he's speaking to the people and he claims to represent the people, and it's been well documented, he's very good on social media. The DDS crowd is very intense, and he has a very direct relationship through social media with his followers. So one audience we wanted to look at is his supporters. How is he interacting with them, and how is the messaging and the narratives that they're using to sell COVID-19 as a national security threat being passed on to the audiences? So the two major groups we've looked at so far are pro-Duterte fan pages and fan groups. and influencers. So I'll get into more of this later on, and then we'll also pair this with statements by Duterte and the key officials. And next slide. Okay, so again, this is really preliminary findings. I just want to put that out there. But the first data set we've looked at is 14 pro-Duterte Facebook pages. These Facebook pages have between, I want to say, 80 to 350,000 likes or followers. And again, like Justin said, we're looking at between March 18th and April 1st, which is 1 week before and 1 week after the passing of the first Heal as One Act. And so going into this, we kind of expected, okay, the way Duterte speaks about quarantine violators, his previous rhetoric with drug addiction and communists, we expected a lot of security language being used, explicit security language. But actually we found almost the opposite. There wasn't any explicit language around threats or shooting people or dehumanizing people to that extent. But instead there was a much more subtle wartime rhetoric. There was a lot of praising of heroes, praising of martyrs, putting up photos of people who had died from COVID. And there was this very intense sense of we're all in this together. And using norms like shaming those who were not doing their part. So for example, they would have, they would share photos of someone who was seen throwing away his relief package and people would comment and say, how dare he's not doing his part, And throughout all of this, there's an intense belief that only Duterte can deliver them from this crisis unscathed, and anyone else would make it so much more worse. There is definitely a sense of us versus them though, but it's not so much pro-Duterte versus the quarantine violators. It's more, the pro-Duterte nationalist people versus those who are just complaining and not doing their part, which then gets coded as the anti-Duterte crowd. And next, and so I'm sorry, there's no pretty way to put screenshots on a single slide, so it looks a bit messy. But here's a few examples of some of the common themes we've seen in some of these fan groups. So to the very right, under the Duterte Youth Party list, they tend to be the most militaristic one, but even then they rarely use explicit military language. But you can see here there is this sense of wartime rhetoric. So it is the duty of every Filipino youth now to help in nation building. And there is targeting of opponents. So the De Duterte group has listed people who voted against giving the president additional powers. And to the very left, there was another group here again praising heroes. This old lady gave away all of her goods to help those in need. And then, so the second set of preliminary findings we wanted to share is we looked at 10 pro-Duterte influencers, again in the same time period. I will say this set of Duterte influencers, though, some began as influencers and since have then been hired into official positions or appointed into official positions in the administration, such as Mocha Yuson. So again, there is some similarity to the fan groups. Nationalist rhetoric is common. Limited explicit security language. Again, they do tend to focus on other areas of the response. So not just the militarization aspect or the military even. They have spoken instead on food redistribution or hazard pay. There is much more direct sharing of official communications, which makes sense. So they are continuously sharing direct videos or statements from the Duterte administration. They tend to be slightly more confrontational with anti-Duterte content. So they will call out anti-Duterte content, such as Oust Duterte hashtag when that was trending, both on Facebook and on Twitter, they would directly engage with it. So even now, if you go on Facebook and you look up Oust Duterte, instead, the most popular posts are actually some of these influencers who have basically they're critiquing the hashtag. So you see more of the critique of the Oust Duterte than the initial Oust Duterte crowd. And so there's also, interestingly, some justification of the government actions, saying, why don't we have enough PPE? And they give an explanation for it, and travel bans and justifying the intense quarantine and the use of military. So there are some slight differences, but again, this is just super early findings. Next slide. And so here's a couple examples by the influencers. To the very left, sharing direct videos of Duterte. To the right, talking about why the PPE shortage is global and the Philippines is actually not doing that badly. And to the very bottom right, we have one of the influencers directly calling an opposition candidate, I believe, a security threat. But even then, that isn't as common as one would expect. And our next step is going to be looking at anti-Duterte content or counter-Duterte content. So for example, the Oust Duterte hashtag will be something we'll be looking at. And we want to do a similar analysis to what we're doing with the pro-Duterte groups, but flipped on the other side. And to the right is just an example of some of this stuff. From a cursory glance, we might expect more criticisms of the militarized response, more calling out of the military, which we have not seen at all with the pro-Duterte groups. And then what we're thinking of is if we could put all of these actors onto a quadrant to try to figure out how do they influence one another and how do they influence the securitization process, we've kind of put it along two spectrums, right? So within securitization theory, there's the notion that the audience you're speaking to will either accept or reject. And so if we frame that on a spectrum on one axis, and then on the other axis, on the y-axis, we have active versus passive, could we plot some of these groups and see how they differ from each other and how they interact? So this is a first stab. Again, this will very likely change after we do a more formal coding of the content. But so we might have, for example, influencers who are active accepting, so in the upper left quadrant, and some of these we've put in there, Mocha Yusan, Thinking Pinoy, Banakay, and then at the bottom section where they still accept the messaging, but they might be a little bit more passive, though I am reticent to use the word passive because some of these groups are very intense and active, so they might actually go between the two. But then once we do our analysis on the other side, we know where would these CSOs, activists, and mainstream news outlets fit? Can we put them on the other side of the chart, and how do they interact with one another? And so next steps, I just want to say that there are a lot of limitations to what we've just presented. None of us speak Tagalog, and so we've had to rely on translations. Fortunately, a lot of the content happened to also be in English. But that is, again, I just want to bring out that limitation. We want to expand our data set and we'll be formalizing the coding moving forward. Again, comparing the different Facebook groups. So when we go into questions, the Q&A section, we would really, really love to hear your feedback. How can we expand the data set? Who are we missing from these data sets? And yeah, any other questions about that stuff would be great.